is Eric Lerner.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jay, and thanks for the other presentations. I just want to be sure that everyone can see my presentation. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Good.
All right. So I too will be talking about what is state-financed capitalism. Basically, excuse me. We have arrived at a critical point in the history of the human race. Humanity is in crisis because capitalist expanded reproduction, as Marx defines it, has come to an end. We've gone from the growing stagnation of the last half century and have entered an actual period of global contraction, similar to the period of the two world wars and the Depression, but with really no capitalist exit possible. Easiest way to see this evolution, I think, is in the simple graph. The blue line shows the rate of mortality decline globally. In other words, the higher that, the faster the rate of mortality is declining, the faster the increase in the standard of living. And we see the pattern that this peaked in the 1960s, where the standard of living was rising very rapidly and immediately started declining into a period of near stagnation by the end of the century. There was a blip in the first decades of the 21st century as China was integrated into the world economy. And now, starting with the crash of 2008, and then greatly accelerating with the pandemic, we have moved into a period of a decline in standards of living and an increase in the mortality rate. In the past 2 years, global mortality rate has been increasing at a rate of 10% per year, very significantly. If we look at the scale of production, we have a very similar story. The rate of energy increase, corrected for the population, again peaked in the 50s and the 60s, and in the 70s started to decline sharply into a long period of near stagnation. Again, there was a blip in the early 21st century, and again, we have moved from stagnation to actual decline, in which the scale of production globally, the scale of production of energy and everything else is actually contracting. The human population is not reproducing itself. In Marxist terms, simple reproduction means that the human population has to at least reproduce itself on the same scale. This is a map of human fertility, and all the areas that are dark green or darker, there are fewer than 2 children per family, which means over the long run, the population is not reproducing itself. It's only in the most impoverished area, such as Africa and parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia, where the populations are almost entirely rural, that reproduction is still continuing. For the vast majority of the population, reproduction is going into decline. So what is happening? Well, what I consider state-financed capitalism, and we may all have different definitions, is the third stage of the US-led global capitalist system. It is the stage of capitalism in decline. The first stage was the post-war recovery, in which there was real growth as the United States wiped out competing capitalists and reconstructed the world economy from huge destruction during the previous generation. At the same time, however, it created a huge war economy which diverted critical economic resources. Nonetheless, this was a period of real growth. The second stage, beginning in the early 1970s, we can get into why this happened, but there was a shift to, as Eric just mentioned, a growing financialization of the economy, which was led by the monopolization of oil and an imposition through an elevated oil price of something like $5 trillion a year on the working class. A transfer of 20% of working class income to the capitalists, a period of slowing growth, growing stagnation, underinvestment, which paved the way for the present crisis, including for the outbreak of the pandemic. Again, there was only a brief respite during the period of the Chinese integration. What we have now is a third stage of capitalism. What I call state-financed capitalism is the state has become the sole source of new investment. As the previous speakers have emphasized, of course, the state has always been involved in capitalism, for example, as an avenue for capitalist investment. But now the state has become the source of investment. So in the last decade of the pre-SFC epoch, most private investment went into the private sector, and very little government investment went into the private sector. In the transition that started to occur after the crash of 2008, private investment became almost half into the government sector because it was seen as the only safe sector. Government investment in the private sector increased to 15% of the total. A critical investment that was needed to prevent the total meltdown of the financial sector in 2008 and 2009. Today, with the pandemic, and more specifically with the onset of the crisis in March of last year, we have had a total shift so that now almost 88% of private investment is going into government bonds, seen as the only safe investment. And government investment has taken over nearly 87% of the total investment in the private sector. How does this work? Well, again, focusing just on the United States, the other countries are very similar. The US Federal Reserve now is 100% of the source of corporate borrowing, corporate bonds. So if you look at the orange line, that's total corporate borrowing, trillions of dollars per year in the United States. The blue line is the lending to the corporate sector by the Federal Reserve. And we see, of course, in 2008, the government became the sole source of lending and remained almost the sole source with ups and downs through approximately 2015. At that point, the Fed felt it safe to stop buying corporate bonds and even for a couple of years sell back some of their holdings. So during that brief period of 4 years, private investment again was lending to companies. With the onset of the pandemic, and especially the crash during the end of March of 2020, again, the Fed became 100% of the lending to corporations. And although it dropped sharply, that lending is again rising to support the corporate bond market. Now, where does this money go? this is, again, Eric mentioned, this money is going 100% into stock buybacks. This is not going at all into the real economy. The blue line here represents total stock sales of stocks on the US stock market, which varies a lot. The red line is the average over 10-year periods. So there isn't a lot of shares being sold on net. But the yellow line, which starts back in the 1990s, is corporate buybacks, mergers and acquisitions, which, as you can see, began with private investment and is now entirely government investment in buybacks. This is the sole reason for the increase in price of shares. And the amount of money in the stock market is not rising, but as buybacks continue, the number of shares available are shrinking. That, by the magic of the stock market, greatly increases the level of assets, which are overwhelmingly held by the very rich. So Senator Manchin said we don't want an entitlement society. The question is, who is entitled? Well, this is who is entitled. This is the increase in the wealth of the very wealthy in the United States. And you see at the end of this graph, a gigantic spike in which $25 trillion a year is being added to the wealth of the wealthiest 1/100th of 1% of the population. This is wealth generated purely by the investment of $1.5 trillion of federal money into the stock market through these corporate loans. This is what I call the biggest daylight heist in history. This is the same story in the EU, in Japan, in China. There is no conspiracy. This is the open, collective, coordinated action of the US-led capitalist class, backed by parties from the Republicans to the Chinese Communist Party. It amounts to a transfer of about 16% of median US household income. It's 5 times the amount of money being considered by the Biden administration. And just considering the billionaires, which are not the only recipients of this wealth, the average government subsidy per billionaire is approximately $4 billion per year. So this is the size of this enormous transfer of state investment. What is the impact on the working class? This is on top of petrocapitalism, on top of the warfare state. It doesn't substitute it for it. It supplements it and accelerates the transfer of wealth from workers to capitalists. How so? Well, obviously, we see already the calls for austerity. Gee, we've spent so much money on the billionaires, there's no money left for schools, hospitals, housing, or anything else. In addition, we are starting to see an effort to cut wages via inflation. Now, why, briefly, are we having inflation now and not in 2008? Well, there were real concessions that were considered politically essential during the pandemic. So there is real consumer demand, which has created, since goods were not produced during the shutdown, real shortages. That spills over some of the fake money, this fictitious capital, from financial assets into real assets, such as oil and real estate. On the other hand, there is also a real shortage of labor. So the attack on working class wages is turning into a labor upsurge. We'll discuss this more in future teach-ins. This is, again, a simple way of looking at it. This is real wages in the United States, which peaked way back in the 1970s. You see a big jump during the pandemic of about 7%, and now a definite retreat because workers, despite strikes, are not yet able to defend the level of wages achieved during the pandemic. But why is this happening now? We get into Luxembourg. Luxembourg's theory of accumulation demonstrated that capitalism requires an external market and an external source of wealth, the continuous transformation of peasants into proletarian, the seizure of peasant land, and a growing external market. That leads to an accelerating urbanization of the entire world, which is a self-limiting process which has now reached its limits. Any process of urbanization, of proletarianization, must follow what scientists call a logistic curve, an S-shaped curve. We can see the example, for example, of South Korea, which underwent a complete urbanization during the last 50 years. Once 50% urbanization is reached, the process has to slow. On a worldwide level, that level of 50% was reached in 2007, not coincidentally at the start of the transition to state-financed capitalism into the end of expanded reproduction. I can go into this more in the discussion. This is another way of showing that up until the 1990s, the rate of accumulation and the rate of urbanization were more or less the same, except for the big blip around 2000, which again was due to Chinese industrialization. Accumulation has been way above urbanization, which is tending towards negative levels due to the growth of fictitious capital. Is there a capitalist exit from this crisis? No. Investment in real production has become unprofitable. And therefore, any concessions, any increase in working class consumption leads to inflation, which threatens to erase capitalist profits and threatens capitalist fictitious capital. This leads to extreme instability in the economy, but means concessions will only be granted when capitalist power is threatened, and permanent concessions requires the removal of capitalist power. The solutions of the 1940s are impossible, as I think should be obvious. Under capitalism, a downward cycle, an ever decreasing standard of living is inevitable. On the other hand, and finally, state-financed capitalism focuses and politicizes the class war. Simply reversing the policy of state-financed capitalism, simply selling the trillions of bonds that the governments have accumulated would lead to the instant bankruptcy of all top financial companies. The government would inherit instantly ownership of 70% of the economy, liberating trillions of dollars needed for social investments. However, the key to that control over the economy is democratic control over finance, not just state ownership, as John pointed out. See the example of China. The earlier transformations of the capitalist economy must also be undone. The petroeconomy must be eliminated with the development of fusion energy, the only possible source of clean, cheap, and safe energy. And the massive real shortages of goods can only be reversed, addressing Eric van der Venter's problem, by ending the warfare economy, by redirecting the vast manufacturing power embodied in the defense sector and the aerospace sector worldwide to the production of real needs. So we'll be discussing much more of that in future teach-ins. I will end there. Thank you, and let the discussion begin.